Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that's, well, constantly in the headlines, constantly shaping political debate, the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, it's unavoidable, really.
And we've got this pretty provocative article in front of us. It's called Stop Pretending You Care About the Constitution by Larken Rose.
Doesn't mince words, does he?
Not at all. So our mission, our goal for this deep dive is to really get past the usual sound bites. We want to dig into his main argument.
Which is pretty explosive.
Right, the idea that neither Democrats nor Republicans, neither major party, consistently respects the Constitution. And we want to explore, what that means.
The implications of that kind of selective approach for liberty, for how government works.
Exactly, because let's be honest, sometimes these constitutional debates just feel like political weapons, right?
Absolutely, just point scoring.
So we're aiming to cut through some of that noise today, find a bit of clarity, maybe even uncover some things you hadn't thought about.
Well, the thing that jumps out immediately with Rose's argument is just how blunt it is. He comes right out, accuses both parties of what he terms selective constitutionalism.
Okay, selective constitutionalism. What does that actually look like in practice, according to him?
It's not that they never mention the Constitution, you see. It's more that they seem to grab it off the shelf only when it helps their case, politically speaking.
Okay, so give us an example. What does he say about, say, the Republicans?
Well, he points to their really strong stance on the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms. That's a cornerstone for them.
Definitely a rallying cry.
But then Rose asks, okay, where is that same constitutional energy when it comes to things like federal power over immigration or federal drug laws?
Ah, okay. So he's saying they champion states' rights or limited government in one area, but maybe not another.
Precisely. He argues those areas, immigration and drug laws, have seen a huge expansion of federal power, something he thinks the framers probably didn't intend.
It makes you wonder then, doesn't it? Is it a consistent principle, or does it sort of bend to fit the policy goal?
That's the core question he raises, and he does the same for the Democrats.
Okay, so what's the example on that side?
He points to how Democrats often, and rightly, champion due process rights. You hear it a lot with criminal justice discussions or scrutinizing government surveillance, that kind of thing, Fifth Amendment stuff.
Right, fundamental protections.
But then Rose suggests that dedication to constitutional limits maybe looks a bit different when the topic shifts to expanding federal power in, say, healthcare or education.
So pushing for bigger federal programs.
Exactly. And Rose asks, does that square with a strict reading of the Constitution's limits on what the federal government is actually supposed to do?
It puts the question out there, doesn't it? Is the Constitution this fixed rule book? Or is it maybe treated more like a flexible tool, something you use to get the policy outcome you want?
That really gets to the heart of it. This isn't just about political mudslinging for Rose. He thinks this selective approach points to something deeper.
Like a fundamental break from the original idea.
Yeah, a kind of disconnect from that core principle of a government with very specific, limited powers. It's almost like the Constitution becomes a buffet. You take the bits you like.
And ignore the parts that are inconvenient.
That's exactly the concern he's voicing. Rose really hammers home the idea that the Constitution was meant to create a federal government with powers that were clearly spelled out, enumerated, and limited.
And he brings up specific parts of the Constitution to back this up, right?
He does. He puts a lot of weight on the 9th and 10th Amendments.
Okay, refresh us quickly on those.
Sure. The 9th basically says that just because a specific right isn't listed in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean the people don't still have it. It's a protection against assuming the list is exhaustive.
Got it. And the 10th?
The 10th is all about federalism. It says any powers that aren't specifically given to the federal government and aren't prohibited from the states, well, they belong to the states, or to the people themselves.
Okay, so fundamental limits.
Exactly. But Rose's point is, how often do you really hear the 9th and 10th Amendments being, central pillars in today's big political debates? He argues they're largely ignored.
By both sides, when it doesn't suit them.
That's his claim. And he uses that federal immigration control example again. He argues that's a power not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution.
Wow. That's a big claim. Most people just assume immigration is a federal issue.
Right. And Rose uses that to illustrate his point. The federal government has steadily grown into areas not on that original explicit list. He sees this as a clear sign that those boundaries, those 10th Amendment boundaries, aren't really being respected.
So connecting this back for the listener, this isn't just historical trivia. It raises a fundamental question about what kind of government we actually have versus maybe what was intended.
Is it still a system of clearly defined enumerated powers? Or has it morphed into something else? That's the uncomfortable question he leaves hanging.
And then the argument takes another turn, right? He gets into the idea of emergency powers.
Yeah, and this is where it gets pretty stark. His argument is basically that when there's a perceived crisis, real or manufactured, constitutional rights tend to go out the window.
For both parties.
He says yes. In the name of necessity, security, whatever the justification is, the constitutional limits get sidelined.
And he draws a historical parallel here, which is quite chilling.
Extremely. He compares it to the Weimar Republic in Germany. He points out how invoking emergency powers there, suspending rights, ultimately eroded the foundations of the Republic and, well, paved the way for totalitarianism.
That's a heavy comparison. It really forces you to stop and think.
It does. It puts that question right in front of you, the listener. How do we balance genuine security needs with protecting those fundamental constitutional rights, especially when times are tough?
Are there really emergency exceptions to basic rights? Or is that precisely when they matter most?
That's the dilemma. Rose clearly falls on the side of rights being paramount, even perhaps especially in emergencies.
It definitely makes you reconsider things. Now, he also touches on something else that might surprise people. The standing army.
Right. This is fascinating history. Rose argues that the founders were deeply, deeply suspicious of a large, permanent military force during peacetime.
Why was that?
Well, they lived under British rule, seeing how a standing army could be used to enforce the will of the government against the people. They were worried about it becoming a tool of oppression.
So the massive military we have today, Rose says that doesn't quite fit the original constitutional vision.
That's his argument. While the Constitution does allow Congress to raise and support armies, he highlights the historical context, the founders' fears, and argues that the sheer size and permanence of today's military is something they likely would have opposed.
Yet today, you'd be hard-pressed to find major political figures in either party seriously advocating for dismantling the standing army.
Absolutely not. It enjoys broad bipartisan support, which for Rose is another example of how far current practice has diverged from what he sees as the original intent, or at least the original concerns.
So putting all this together, Rose's view seems to be that the Constitution isn't really working as that intended break on federal power.
Not in practice, no. And this leads him to use some really strong language. He calls the current federal government a lawless oligarchy.
Wow, that's intense. Lawless oligarchy. What does he mean by that?
His critique is incredibly direct here. He's basically saying that the federal government, regardless of who's nominally in charge, operates largely outside the intended constitutional constraints.
Acting in its own interests, or the interests of powerful groups, rather than sticking to the rulebook.
That's the accusation. He sees all the talk about the Constitution, the oaths of office, the references and speeches, as mostly for show.
Like a performance. A kind of hollow ritual, as you put it earlier.
Exactly. A ritual that pays lip service to the Constitution but doesn't translate into actual, consistent limits on government action. Actions contradict the stated principles, in his view.
So underneath the rhetoric, what does he see as the real driving force for both parties?
Centralized power. He believes both parties, when you look at their actions over time, fundamentally favor concentrating power at the federal level, if that power can be used to achieve their specific policy aims.
Which stands in pretty stark contrast to the ideas we usually associate with the Constitution's founding, right? Like individual liberty, decentralized power.
Completely opposed, in Rose's view. He sees it as a fundamental betrayal of those principles. The system was designed to disperse power, to limit it, and he sees modern politics constantly pushing in the opposite direction towards more centralization.
And he uses an analogy to make this clearer, right? Something about religion.
Yeah, it's a pretty effective analogy, actually. He compares selectively following the Constitution to selectively following a religion.
How did that work?
He basically asks, imagine someone says they deeply believe in a particular faith, but then they only follow the rules they like. They ignore the inconvenient commandments, rationalize away the difficult parts.
Okay, I see where he's going.
Does that person truly believe, or are they just using the label when it suits them? He applies the same logic to the Constitution. What does it mean to uphold it if you only uphold the clauses that advance your agenda?
It highlights that inconsistency he sees everywhere. It makes the concept really relatable.
It definitely does. It challenges the notion that you can claim allegiance to a whole system while picking and choosing which parts you adhere to.
And then, Just when you think you have his argument pinned down, he adds this final twist
Right.
about his own views.
Right. It's a fascinating kicker. He admits that he personally doesn't actually believe the Constitution itself goes far enough in limiting government. He thinks it still allows for too much state power.
So he's not even a constitutionalist in the traditional sense.
Not really, but his point is one of consistency. He says, look, even by the standard set in this document, which I think is too low, the people in power aren't meeting it. They aren't being consistent.
So he's saying, I might disagree with the premise, but at least I'm consistent in my view, unlike those who claim to revere it, but apply it selectively.
Precisely. It adds this layer of, you could say, intellectual honesty to his critique. It forces even staunch constitutionalists to confront that question. Is the Constitution, as currently interpreted and applied, truly serving its purpose as a check on power?
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. As we finish this deep dive into Larken Rose's article, what's the main takeaway for listeners?
I think the core message, the central challenge, is his forceful argument about selective constitutionalism. The idea that both major parties use the Constitution more as a political tool than a guiding principle.
Invoking it when it helps, ignoring it when it hurts their agenda.
Yeah, and this leads directly to that big final question for you, the listener, to really chew on. What are the real long-term effects of using the Constitution this way? Does this selective invocation actually strengthen its authority in American life? Or does it maybe slowly chip away at its legitimacy? Does it weaken its power as a genuine constraint on government?
That is a heavy question to consider. Does treating it like a sometimes document ultimately undermine it altogether?
It's something worth reflecting on. We really encourage you to think about your own views, your own assumptions about the Constitution, and watch closely how its principles are actually applied or maybe not applied in the political world around you.
Definitely food for thought.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.